A California 1980 cold case was finally solved when an arrest shocked the entire community. Robin Gisela Brooks never made it to work at the Sacramento yogurt shop on April 24, 1980. Her friend found her body in the small apartment on La Riviera Drive, raped and murdered at just 20 years old. 6 weeks later, and hundreds of miles away in Ada County, Idaho, 25-year-old Mary Tracy was discovered slain beside a quiet country road. 2 young women, 2 families destroyed, 2 communities living in fear of a predator who vanished without a trace. For over 40 years, detectives gathered fingerprints and fibers, families held candlelight vigils, and hope slowly faded into whispered prayers. Then, in 2018, genetic genealogy changed everything. Scientists could now build family trees from a single drop of blood. But when DNA finally revealed the truth, it shattered everything these communities thought they knew about the people living among them. Who was the killer hiding in plain sight for 4 decades? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Robin's time card showed exactly 6 o'clock when she punched out on April 23, 1980. The young woman hummed quietly as she locked the Sacramento yogurt shop, keys jingling against the evening air. She waved goodbye to the manager and stepped into the parking lot, her nursing textbooks tucked under one arm. The Sacramento spring felt warm against her face as she walked toward her small apartment on La Riviera Drive. Robin Gisela Brooks had always been the type to notice everything: the elderly man who bought vanilla yogurt every Tuesday, the mother who brought her twin daughters for strawberry treats after school, the way shadows fell differently across the shop's windows as seasons changed. Tonight, something felt different. She paused by her car and glanced back across the parking lot. Someone stood near the bus. Stop watching. The figure stepped back into darkness before she could make out any features. Robin shook her head and drove home, humming along to the radio. She had letters to write to her parents, homework to finish, and dreams to chase. At 20 years old, she was finally living independently for the first time, savoring the freedom while missing the comfort of her close Christian home. She pulled into her apartment complex and gathered her things, still unaware that tomorrow would never come. The yogurt shop stayed closed the next morning. Robin's coworker paced outside the locked doors at 8 a.m., checking her watch every few minutes. Robin had never been late, not once in 8 months of working together. Something was wrong. By 9:30, concern turned to panic. The coworker called Robin's apartment repeatedly, hearing only the hollow ring of an unanswered phone. She drove to La Riviera Drive and knocked on the door until her knuckles hurt. Silence. The apartment manager reluctantly agreed to use his key. The crime scene photos would later show what no heart should ever see. Robin lay in her small bedroom, her nursing textbooks scattered on the floor beside her. She had been raped and murdered, her young life snuffed out by someone who had watched her, followed her, and destroyed everything she was meant to become. Sacramento police arrived within minutes of the call. Detective Frank Morrison, a 20-year veteran, took one look at the scene and knew this wasn't random. Someone had planned this carefully, waiting for the right moment to strike. The killer had left behind fingerprints, fibers, and what would prove to be the most important evidence of all drops of DNA that 1980s technology couldn't yet decode. Mrs. Brooks received the call at noon. She collapsed in her kitchen, the phone falling from her trembling hands as Robin's father rushed to catch her. Their daughter, their bright, careful, loving daughter, was gone. The Brooks family's world shattered into pieces that would take decades to reassemble. News crews gathered outside the apartment complex by evening. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors about locks and safety and the sudden realization that evil could live anywhere, could strike anyone. The investigation began immediately, but hope was already cracking like glass under pressure. 600 miles northeast in Ada County, Idaho, Mary Tracy laughed with neighbors at a spring picnic. Her camera clicked constantly, capturing children chasing butterflies and elderly couples sharing sandwiches on checkered blankets. Photography was Mary's passion. She dreamed of becoming a photojournalist, documenting stories that mattered. At 25, Mary had inherited her mother's warmth and her father's adventurous spirit. She baked pies for community dinners, organized hiking trips in Idaho's foothills, and looked after her younger cousins with fierce protectiveness. Her laughter carried across the picnic grounds, genuine and infectious. Mary's beloved Nikon camera held 23 photos from that perfect afternoon, children's faces bright with ice cream, her brother Jake carving his initials into a picnic table, an elderly woman feeding ducks by the pond. Normal moments from what should have been an ordinary day in an ordinary life. As evening approached, Mary packed her camera carefully in its leather case and said goodbye to friends. She had promised to help her neighbor with yard work early the next morning, so she needed to get home. Several people offered to follow her. The country roads could be dark and confusing, but Mary declined with a wave. She knew every back road in Ada County, every shortcut and scenic route. Mary climbed into her pickup truck and pulled out of the picnic area, humming along to country music on the radio. In the rearview mirror, she could see families packing up blankets and folding chairs. Normal people doing normal things, unaware that something terrible was about to shatter their peaceful community. She drove toward home alone, her camera beside her on the passenger seat. The 24th photo would never be taken. Dawn broke gray and cold across Idaho farmland on June 1st, 1980. A rancher checking fence lines spotted something that didn't belong near the old dirt road. At first, he thought it might be a deer that had been hit by a passing car. Then he saw the pickup truck in the ditch, driver's door hanging open. Mary Tracy's body lay 20 feet from her vehicle. She had been beaten and strangled, her camera smashed beyond repair. The peaceful country road had become a crime scene, yellow tape fluttering in the morning wind like prayer flags marking a tragedy. Ada County Sheriff William Patterson arrived within the hour. A 40-year veteran of rural law enforcement, Patterson had seen his share of domestic disputes and bar fights, but nothing like this. Mary Tracy was well known and well loved in the tight-knit community. Someone had specifically targeted her, followed her down a deserted road, and committed an act of pure evil. The sheriff knelt beside Mary's parents in their living room that afternoon, his hat in his hands and tears in his eyes. Mary's father sat motionless in his chair while her mother sobbed into his shoulder. Jake Tracy paced the room like a caged animal, demanding answers that nobody had. Sheriff Patterson pulled out a piece of department letterhead and wrote carefully by hand, "I promise you that we will find the person who did this to Mary. I will not rest until justice is served." He signed his name and gave the letter to Mary's father, sealing a vow that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The investigation consumed the sheriff's department. They processed fingerprints, collected tire tracks, and interviewed every person who had attended the picnic. But leads evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense that a predator walked freely among them. Summer heat baked the Sacramento streets as Detective Morrison launched the most intensive investigation in the department's recent memory. Every person who had visited Robin's yogurt shop received a visit from police. Every neighbor was interviewed repeatedly. Composite sketches were drawn and redrawn based on conflicting witness descriptions. The grainy police drawing showed a middle-aged white male with dark hair and an average build, a description that could fit thousands of Sacramento residents. Copies were posted on every bulletin board in the city, printed in newspapers, and shown on the evening news. Tips poured in by the hundreds, each one carefully investigated and ultimately leading nowhere. Robin's parents moved through the investigation like sleepwalkers. Mrs. Brooks kept Robin's bedroom exactly as she had left it, nursing textbooks on the desk, clothes folded in the dresser, a half-finished letter to her grandmother tucked under her pillow. She organized search parties and distributed flyers, transforming her grief into relentless action. Mr. Brooks, a methodical former mechanic, started keeping detailed notes in a thick spiral notebook. He tracked every piece of evidence, every interview, every lead that fizzled out. His garage workshop became a shrine to the investigation, walls covered with maps and timelines and photographs of his daughter's face. The Sacramento Bee ran front-page stories for 2 weeks before other news pushed Robin's murder to the inside pages. Public attention faded, but the Brooks family refused to let their daughter's case disappear. They printed their own flyers, organized their own searches, and begged anyone with information to come forward. Detective Morrison worked 16-hour days, following leads that dissolved like smoke. He interviewed hundreds of people and processed dozens of tips, but the killer remained invisible. DNA technology existed in 1980, but it was primitive, requiring large samples and producing limited results. The evidence collected from Robin's apartment would have to wait for science to catch up. By autumn, even the most optimistic investigators began to realize they might be looking for a ghost. Idaho's autumn painted the foothills in gold and red, while Sheriff Patterson's investigation ground forward with little progress. Ballistics experts examined every piece of evidence from Mary's truck. Fingerprint specialists dusted every surface that might hold a clue. The results told them nothing useful. Either the killer had worn gloves or he had never been arrested before. The tight-knit farming community began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Neighbors who had known each other for decades started locking their doors at night. Parents walked their children to school instead of letting them ride bikes. The local diner buzzed with theories and accusations, friendships strained by paranoia and fear. Jake Tracy channeled his grief into action, just like Robin's parents hundreds of miles away. He organized search parties that combed every inch of Ada County's back roads. He printed missing person flyers even though Mary had been found, hoping someone would remember seeing her truck that night or noticing a suspicious vehicle in the area. On a crisp October morning, Jake drove to the site where Mary's body had been discovered. He carried tools and lumber, working alone to build something permanent. The white memorial cross he carved by hand stood 4 feet tall, weathered wood inscribed with Mary's name and dates. "Beloved daughter and sister," he wrote at the bottom. "Gone, but not forgotten." Local farmers stopped their tractors when they passed the cross. Teenagers left flowers there after school. Mary's high school friends tied ribbons to the wooden arms, faded now by sun and rain but still marking the spot where an innocent life ended. The cross became a symbol of the community's refusal to let Mary's death be forgotten, even as the investigation stalled. Sheriff Patterson drove past it every morning on his way to work, the wooden memorial serving as a daily reminder of his promise to find justice. Christmas 1980 arrived with empty chairs at holiday tables in both Sacramento and Ada County. The Brooks family stared at Robin's unused place setting, her favorite cranberry sauce growing cold beside an untouched plate. 300 miles away, Mary's family gathered around their own diminished table. Her vacant chair, a constant reminder of all the holidays she would never share. Mrs. Brooks spent the holiday writing letters, dozens of them, addressed to governors and senators and anyone with the power to provide more resources for unsolved murder cases. Her careful cursive filled page after page with pleas for help, descriptions of Robin's unfulfilled dreams, and desperate requests for justice. Mary's father wrote similar letters from his kitchen table in Idaho, his farmer's hands struggling with the pen as he begged officials to remember his daughter. Both families stuffed envelopes with newspaper clippings, crime scene photos, and testimonials from friends who remembered their daughter's bright spirits. The responses were form letters, polite but impersonal acknowledgments stamped "received by junior staffers." Some included brochures about victim support services. None offered additional resources or renewed hope. The family's carefully written pleas disappeared into government filing cabinets, their pain reduced to paperwork. On New Year's Eve, both families skipped the traditional celebrations. Instead, they held quiet vigils in their homes, lighting candles and sharing memories of daughters who would never see 1981. Friends and neighbors joined them, filling living rooms with whispered stories and stubborn hope. The calendar changed, but their determination did not. Mrs. Brooks organized a letter-writing campaign, rallying other victims and families to flood government offices with requests for cold case resources. Mr. Brooks expanded his investigation notebook, adding pages for similar unsolved murders across California. Both families entered 1981 with the same resolution. They would never stop fighting for their daughters, no matter how many years passed or how many official letters went unanswered. 5 years blurred together like time-lapse photography, each season bleeding into the next without resolution. The Reagan administration settled into Washington while families in Sacramento and Idaho marked anniversaries of loss instead of celebrations of life. Media attention drifted to fresher tragedies, leaving Robin's and Mary's murders to gather dust in filing cabinets. Detective Morrison retired in 1983, his replacement inheriting boxes of evidence that told incomplete stories. New investigators reviewed the files periodically, but leads that had gone cold in 1980 remained frozen in 1985. The composite sketches yellowed with age, the witness statements grew stale, and hope became something families hoarded like precious coins. Mrs. Brooks transformed into a different person, her quiet nature hardening into relentless advocacy. She joined victims' rights organizations, lobbied for legislative changes, and mentored other families navigating similar tragedies. Her kitchen table became a command center for a growing network of parents who refused to let their children be forgotten. Technology advanced slowly during those years. Personal computers arrived in offices, DNA science evolved in university laboratories, and forensic techniques improved incrementally. But for families waiting for answers, progress felt glacial. Science moved forward while their cases moved backward, sliding from active investigations to cold storage. Mr. Brooks filled 3 notebooks with his methodical tracking of every detail, every anniversary, every small development in Robin's case. His garage workshop walls displayed timelines and photographs and maps marked with red pins. Neighbors worried about his obsession, but his wife understood the notebooks and charts and endless documentation were how he kept Robin alive. By 1985, evidence storage boxes from both cases were wheeled into archive rooms, their contents carefully cataloged but rarely accessed. The DNA samples that would eventually solve both murders sat preserved in freezers, waiting for science to evolve enough to read their secrets. The late 1980s brought whispers of revolutionary changes in forensic science. DNA analysis emerged from research laboratories into courtrooms, promising to solve cases that had baffled investigators for years. Detective Laura Reyes inherited Robin's file in 1987, fresh from the police academy and eager to make a difference in unsolved cases. Reyes visited the Brooks family monthly, explaining each small development in language they could understand. She had them retested the preserved evidence using newer techniques, but the results remained frustratingly incomplete. The DNA samples were too small, too degraded, or too contaminated for 1980s technology to process effectively. Wait for better technology, the lab technicians advised. Science will catch up. In Idaho, Detective Samuel Olson reopened Mary's case with similar hopes and similar disappointments. The evidence preserved from 1980 held promise, but the equipment needed to unlock its secrets didn't exist yet. Both detectives attended forensic conferences, hoping to learn about advances that might help their cold cases. DNA databases were established by the FBI in the late 1980s, but they contained profiles from only the most serious repeat offenders. The genetic genealogy techniques that would eventually solve both murders remained decades in the future. For families still waiting for answers, scientific progress felt torturously slow. Mrs. Brooks started attending crime victim conferences, meeting other mothers whose children had been taken by violence. She learned about advances in evidence processing, lobbying techniques, and ways to keep old cases in the public eye. Her quiet grief evolved into organized activism. Both Detective Reyes and Detective Olson inherited not just case files but relationships with families who had been waiting years for justice. They made promises similar to those made by their predecessors, hoping that new science and fresh perspectives might finally break open cases that had remained sealed for nearly a decade. Robin's 26th birthday would have fallen on September 15, 1986. Instead of celebrating with cake and candles, Mrs. Brooks announced the establishment of the Robin Brooks Memorial Nursing Scholarship at Sacramento Community College. The ceremony was held in the school's library. Robin's photograph displayed alongside information about the scholarship fund. Robin dreamed of becoming a nurse, Mrs. Brooks told the small gathering of family members and college officials. She wanted to help people, to ease suffering, to make a difference in the world. This scholarship will help other young women pursue the dream that was stolen from her. The scholarship would award $1,000 annually to a nursing student who demonstrated both academic achievement and commitment to community service qualities that had defined Robin's short life. Mrs. Brooks had raised the initial funding through bake sales, letter-writing campaigns, and donations from church members who remembered Robin's kindness. The local newspaper photographer captured the moment when Mrs. Brooks signed the official scholarship documents, her composed smile masking years of accumulated grief. The photograph ran on the front page of the Sacramento Bee's community section, reminding readers that Robin's murder remained unsolved. Mr. Brooks stood beside his wife during the ceremony, his investigation notebook tucked under his arm as always. He had documented every aspect of the scholarship's creation, just as he tracked every detail of the murder investigation. The scholarship represented transformation, turning their painful loss into something that would help other families achieve dreams. The first recipient was a 20-year-old single mother whose own dreams of nursing had been delayed by financial hardship. When she accepted the scholarship check, she promised Mrs. Brooks that she would honor Robin's memory by dedicating her career to helping others. The scholarship ceremony marked a turning point in how the Brooks family processed their grief, channeling their pain into purpose while never abandoning their quest for justice. Throughout the 1992s and early 2000s, both families joined a growing network of cold case advocates who shared strategies and supported each other through the long wait for answers. They attended victims' rights rallies in state capitals, testified before legislative committees, and appeared on television shows dedicated to unsolved crimes. Mary's family organized annual memorial hikes along her favorite trails in the Idaho foothills, drawing dozens of participants who carried photographs of other missing persons and murder victims. The events raised money for search and rescue organizations while keeping Mary's case visible to the public. Jake Tracy learned carpentry skills specifically so he could hand-carve memorial crosses for other families dealing with unsolved murders. His workshop filled with orders from across the Pacific Northwest, each cross personalized with names, dates, and brief inscriptions, celebrating lives cut short. The work gave his grief a productive outlet while connecting him to a community of people who understood his pain. In 1997, both Robin's and Mary's cases were featured on a late-night television show called Unsolved: Mysteries of the American West. The program reenacted the murders using local actors and included interviews with family members pleading for new information. The exposure generated dozens of tips, but none led to credible suspects. Mrs. Brooks appeared on camera wearing the same dress she had worn to Robin's funeral, her gray hair neatly styled and her voice steady despite obvious emotion. "Someone knows what happened to our daughter," she said directly to the camera. "Someone has been living with this secret for 17 years. It's time to tell the truth." The television appearance brought new attention to both cases, but no breakthrough. Still, the families considered it worthwhile if even one viewer remembered something useful from April and June of 1980. Charles Nicholas Strain died in an Idaho state prison on November 3, 2007, his body claimed by no family members and buried in an unmarked grave at state expense. Prison records showed he had served time for burglary, assault, and weapons charges, but officials noted his death as routine paperwork. Strain had been a drifter and an outsider, cycling through odd jobs in temporary housing before landing in prison for crimes unrelated to Mary Tracy's murder. Fellow inmates remembered him as withdrawn and volatile, someone who kept to himself and avoided forming relationships. His death certificate listed natural causes: a heart attack in his cell during the night. The prison chaplain noted that Strain had refused religious counseling throughout his incarceration and had designated no next of kin. His personal effects filled a single cardboard box: worn work boots, a few paperback novels, and yellowed photographs of hunting trips from decades past. None of the investigators working Mary's case knew about Strain's death. His criminal record showed no connection to Ada County in 1980, and he had never appeared on the radar of potential suspects. The DNA sample that would eventually link him to Mary's murder sat preserved in an evidence freezer while his body was lowered into an anonymous grave. Prison officials sealed Strain's medical and disciplinary records according to standard protocol, then filed the paperwork in storage rooms where it would remain undisturbed for years. The man who had murdered Mary Tracy became nothing more than a manila folder in a government filing cabinet. His death meant that when DNA finally revealed his identity, there would be no arrest, no trial, no opportunity for Mary's family to confront their daughter's killer. Justice would come in the form of answers rather than punishment, closure rather than revenge. The 2010 seconds brought revolutionary advances in forensic science that would eventually crack both cold cases wide open. Rapid DNA analysis could process samples in hours instead of weeks. Genetic genealogy websites allowed users to upload DNA profiles and discover distant relatives they never knew existed. Detective Laura Reyes, now a veteran investigator with Sacramento PD, attended workshops on genetic genealogy techniques throughout 2008 and 2009. The science was complex, but the concept was simple. DNA could be used to build family trees, connecting crime scene evidence to relatives of potential suspects. Detective Samuel Olson in Idaho received similar training, learning how to collaborate with genealogists who specialized in cold case investigations. The two detectives had never met, but they were following parallel paths that would eventually intersect through science and determination. Both departments made the decision to retest every piece of preserved evidence using the most advanced techniques available. The DNA samples that had been too small or too degraded for 1980s and 1990 seconds technology might finally yield usable profiles with 2010 seconds methods. The Brooks and Tracy families watched these developments with cautious hope. They had endured decades of false starts and disappointing test results. New technology promised breakthroughs, but so had previous advances that ultimately failed to identify their daughter's killers. Mrs. Brooks attended a cold case conference in 2017 where she met other families whose decades-old murders had been solved using genetic genealogy. Their stories rekindled hope she thought she had lost forever. Science had finally evolved to match the determination of families who refused to give up. Both detectives prepared to submit their preserved evidence for the most comprehensive DNA analysis ever attempted on their cases, hoping that 40-year-old biological samples would finally reveal names instead of just tantalizing possibilities. January 15th, 2018 marked a turning point in Robin's case when Sacramento crime lab technicians extracted a complete male DNA profile from biological evidence preserved since 1980. The breakthrough came through new extraction techniques that could isolate genetic material from samples previously considered too degraded to process. The computer screen displayed rows of genetic markers that told a story the original investigators could never have read. The DNA profile was uploaded to criminal databases first, hoping for an immediate match with a known offender. When that search proved fruitless, Detective Reyes authorized the next step: genetic genealogy. The lab report confirmed what investigators had suspected for nearly 40 years. Robin's killer was male, and he had left enough biological evidence to potentially identify him through advanced science. The profile was complete enough for familial searching, meaning investigators could now look for the killer's relatives rather than the killer himself. Detective Reyes printed multiple copies of the DNA report and drove immediately to the Brooks family home. She found Mrs. Brooks tending her garden, gray-haired now but still energetic at 73. The news that science had finally extracted a complete DNA profile from Robin's case brought tears that had been held back for decades. "This means we can find him?" Mrs. Brooks asked, clutching the lab report with soil-stained gardening gloves. "It means we have the best chance we've ever had," Detective Reyes replied carefully. She had learned not to make promises she couldn't keep, but the DNA profile represented the most significant breakthrough in the case since 1980. The genetic genealogy process would take months, possibly longer. Scientists would need to build family trees from the DNA profile, identify potential suspects, and then verify matches through traditional investigative methods. But for the first time in 38 years, Robin's killer had a genetic signature that could lead investigators directly to his door. Spring 2019 brought similar breakthrough news to the Tracy family when Idaho State Crime Lab successfully processed DNA evidence from Mary's 1980 murder. The sample was more challenging than Robin's partially degraded and mixed with environmental contamination from the rural crime scene, but advanced techniques produced a usable genetic profile. Dr. Faith Hernandez, a genetic genealogist who specialized in cold cases, accepted the assignment to build family trees from both DNA profile. Working from her small laboratory office lined with genealogy charts and computer screens, she began the painstaking process of connecting genetic markers to real families. The work required patience and precision. Dr. Hernandez uploaded the unknown DNA profiles to genealogy databases and waited for matches with people who had voluntarily submitted their own genetic information. Initial matches were typically distant relatives, third or fourth cousins who shared great-great-grandparents with the suspects. From these distant connections, Dr. Hernandez worked backward through time, building family trees that stretched across generations. Birth certificates, marriage records, obituaries, and census data helped her map relationships between people separated by decades and geography. Each family tree grew larger and more complex as she traced bloodlines forward to the present day. The process was like solving a jigsaw puzzle with thousands of pieces and no picture on the box. Every genetic match provided another piece of the puzzle, but the complete image remained hidden until enough connections were made to see the pattern. Mary's case proved particularly challenging because the DNA profile was partial, limiting the number of genetic markers available for comparison. Dr. Hernandez spent months building and rebuilding family trees, following leads that sometimes dead-ended with adoptions or incomplete records. But she persisted, knowing that somewhere in the tangled branches of these family trees were the identities of two killers who had hidden their crimes for 4 decades. March 12, 2020 would later be remembered as the day Robin's case finally broke open. Dr. Hernandez called Detective Reyes with news that genetic genealogy had identified a suspect, a local Sacramento man whose DNA profile matched crime scene evidence with overwhelming statistical certainty. The suspect was 62 years old, married, and employed as a maintenance supervisor for a commercial property management company. He lived less than 10 miles from Robin's old apartment, had worked in the area during 1980, and had no alibi for the night of April 24th that investigators could verify. Surveillance teams began following the suspect immediately, documenting his daily routines while detectives built a case for arrest. He followed rigid patterns, same coffee shop every morning, same routes to work, same grocery store every Saturday. His predictability made surveillance easier but also revealed a personality type consistent with someone who had managed to hide a terrible secret for 40 years. Detective Reyes watched from an unmarked car as the suspect performed ordinary activities, buying groceries, visiting his bank, stopping at the post office. She wondered how many times Robin's parents had unknowingly encountered their daughter's killer during 4 decades of living in the same community. The arrest came at dawn on March 20th, 2020. Officers surrounded the suspect's house as he prepared to leave for work, handcuffing him in his driveway while neighbors watched in shock. The man who had terrorized Sacramento in 1980 had been hiding in plain sight, living an apparently normal life while Robin's family suffered through decades of unanswered questions. News of the arrest spread quickly through social media and local television, stunning a community that thought Robin's murder would never be solved. The arrest warrant named the suspect and detailed how genetic genealogy had finally identified him after 40 years of freedom. The interrogation room at Sacramento Police Department had white walls, fluorescent lighting, and a single table where the 62-year-old suspect sat across from Detective Reyes and her partner. He wore the same clothes he had put on for work that morning, never imagining he would end the day in handcuffs. "I don't know what you're talking about," he repeated when shown Robin's photograph. "I never met this girl. I never hurt anyone." His denials were consistent and delivered without obvious emotion. He had clearly prepared for this possibility, developing explanations for potential questions about his whereabouts in 1980. But he had not prepared for the advances in DNA science that made his denials irrelevant. Detective Reyes slid the genetic analysis report across the table. 20 pages of scientific documentation showed how his DNA profile matched biological evidence from Robin's apartment with a probability of accuracy exceeding 99.9%. The numbers were indisputable, even if his memory remained conveniently blank. "DNA doesn't lie," Detective Reyes said quietly. "It's been waiting 40 years to tell Robin's story." The suspect studied the report for several minutes, his hands trembling slightly as he turned pages filled with genetic charts and statistical analysis. The interrogation video captured the moment when 4 decades of careful deception collapsed under the weight of scientific evidence. He requested a lawyer and refused to answer further questions. But his silence couldn't overcome the biological truth preserved in evidence freezers since 1980. Robin's DNA had been waiting patiently for science to evolve enough to read its story, and that story pointed directly to the man sitting in handcuffs. The arrest made national news, another example of genetic genealogy solving cold cases that traditional investigation methods couldn't crack. For Robin's family, the arrest answered the question that had haunted them for 40 years: who killed their daughter? Sacramento Superior Court was packed with reporters, family members, and community representatives when the preliminary hearing began in July 2020. Mrs. Brooks sat in the front row, clutching her husband's hand as prosecutors outlined their case against Robin's accused killer. The evidence presentation took 2 days. Crime scene photographs from 1980 were displayed alongside DNA analysis reports from 2020, showing how science had bridged 4 decades to identify a suspect. Expert witnesses explained genetic genealogy in language that jurors could understand, walking them through the process process of building family trees from biological evidence. Mrs. Brooks testified about losing her daughter, her voice steady but her eyes filled with tears that had waited 40 years to fall in a courtroom. She described Robin's dreams of becoming a nurse, her kindness to elderly neighbors, and the scholarship fund that had helped dozens of young women pursue careers in healthcare. Robin would have been 60 years old this year, Mrs. Brooks told the judge. She would have been a grandmother by now, probably still working as a nurse, still helping people. Instead, we have an empty chair at our table and 40 years of wondering who took her away from us. Mr. Brooks testified next, his investigation notebook stacked beside him as evidence of a father's relentless pursuit of truth. He had documented every lead, every disappointment, every small development in Robin's case. His methodical record-keeping had preserved details that helped prosecutors build their timeline of events. The defense attorney argued that DNA evidence alone was insufficient for conviction, especially after 4 decades of potential contamination, but the genetic analysis was overwhelming. Statistical evidence showed the probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than the defendant was virtually impossible. Judge Patricia Manning listened to 2 days of testimony before ruling that sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause as Robin's family clasped hands and whispered prayers of gratitude. Outside the courthouse, Detective Reyes spoke to reporters about the power of persistence and advancing science. This case shows that families should never give up hope, she said. Technology will continue to improve, and justice has no expiration date. August 2021 brought unexpected developments in Mary Tracy's case, when genetic genealogy finally linked the partial DNA profile to Charles Nicholas Strain. Detective Olson spent weeks verifying the connection, tracking Strain's movements through Idaho in 1980 and confirming his presence in Ada County during the time of Mary's murder. Prison records showed that Strain had been arrested for burglary in Boise just 3 months after Mary's death, suggesting he had remained in Idaho following the murder. His criminal history revealed a pattern of violence against women, including assault charges that had been plea bargained down to lesser offenses. Detective Olson contacted the prison where Strain had died in 2007, requesting access to his personal effects and medical records. The cardboard box of belongings revealed hunting licenses from the 1972nd and 1980s, confirming Strain's familiarity with remote areas of Idaho where someone could dispose of evidence or attack isolated victims. The breakthrough came when investigators matched Strain's military service records to the timeline of Mary's murder. He had been dishonorably discharged from the Army in 1979 and had drifted through temporary jobs across the Pacific Northwest. Employment records showed he had worked for a logging company near Ada County in spring 1980. Dr. Hernandez's genetic analysis showed the probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than Strain was less than 1 in 10 billion. The statistical evidence was overwhelming, but there would be no trial, no opportunity for Mary's family to confront their daughter's killer in court. Detective Olson called the Tracy family with news that was both satisfying and frustrating. They finally knew who had murdered Mary, but the killer had died in prison 14 years earlier, never knowing that science would eventually expose his crime. The identification of Charles Strain as Mary's killer meant justice would come in the form of answers rather than punishment, closure rather than courtroom confrontation. January 15th, 2022 marked exactly 42 years since Robin's murder when her family returned to Sacramento Superior Court for the trial they had waited decades to witness. The courtroom was packed with community members, victim advocates, and journalists covering the case that had finally reached its legal conclusion. Prosecutor Daniel Kim stood before the jury with a genetic evidence chart that looked like a complex family tree. In simple, clear language, he explained how DNA analysis had connected biological evidence from 1980 to the defendant sitting at the defense table. Science has given Robin Brooks a voice, Kim told the jurors. After 42 years of silence, she can finally tell us who took her life. The trial lasted 6 days. Expert witnesses testified about DNA collection, preservation, and analysis. Detective Reyes walked jurors through the investigation timeline, showing how genetic genealogy had succeeded where traditional methods had failed. Crime scene technicians explained how biological evidence had been carefully preserved for 4 decades, waiting for science to evolve enough to read its secrets. The defendant's attorney argued that the passage of time had corrupted evidence and memories, making a fair trial impossible. But the DNA evidence was irrefutable. Genetic markers that had waited patiently in evidence freezers since 1980 now pointed directly to his client with overwhelming statistical certainty. Mrs. Brooks attended every day of the trial, often accompanied by recipients of Robin's scholarship fund who wanted to honor the young woman whose dreams had inspired their own careers. The scholarship students wore small pins with Robin's photograph, silent testimony to a life that had continued to make a difference even after death. On the trial's final day, Kim delivered a closing argument that traced the journey from Robin's murder in 1980 to scientific breakthrough in 2020. Justice delayed is not justice denied, he told the jury. Robin Brooks has waited 42 years to tell her story. Today, science finally gives her that voice. February 8, 2022 would be remembered as the day justice finally arrived for Robin Brooks. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning to the packed courtroom with their verdict. Mrs. Brooks gripped her husband's hand. As the foreman stood to read the decision that had been 4 decades in the making, "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom remained silent for several heartbeats before quiet applause rippled through the gallery. Robin's family sat motionless, tears streaming down faces that had carried grief for 42 years. The scholarship students wearing Robin's photograph hugged each other in the back rows. Judge Manning scheduled sentencing for the following week, but the outcome was predetermined under California law. Murder in the first degree carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had stolen Robin's life would spend the remainder of his own behind bars. Outside the courthouse, Mrs. Brooks spoke to reporters with remarkable composure. "Robin was 20 years old when she died," she said. "She had so many dreams, so many plans. Today, 42 years later, she finally got justice." Mr. Brooks stood beside his wife, his investigation notebooks tucked under his arm one final time. "We promised Robin we would never give up," he whispered to Detective Reyes. "We kept our promise." The verdict made national headlines as another example of genetic genealogy solving decades-old cold cases. But for the Brooks family, the news coverage was less important than the personal satisfaction of seeing their daughter's killer finally held accountable. At sentencing the following week, the judge imposed the mandatory sentence of life without parole. Robin's killer would never again walk free in the community where he had hidden his crime for 4 decades. March 2024 brought closure to Mary Tracy's case when Idaho officials held a press conference announcing that Charles Nicholas Strain had been definitively identified as her killer through genetic genealogy. Sheriff's deputies, state investigators, and members of the Tracy family gathered on the courthouse steps, where justice had been delayed but not denied. Ada County Sheriff Jennifer Walsh read from prepared remarks that officially closed Mary's case after 44 years. "Through advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, we have identified Charles Nicholas Strain as the person responsible for Mary Tracy's murder on June 1, 1980, she announced to assembled reporters. The Tracy family stood together as cameras captured their mixed emotions, relief at finally having answers, frustration that the killer had died before facing justice. Jake Tracy, now gray-haired and weathered by decades of advocacy work, spoke for the family. "We always knew this day would come," he said. "We never gave up believing that science would eventually tell us who killed our Mary. Even though Charles Strain is dead, knowing his name gives us the closure we've needed for 44 years. The press conference included displays of evidence that had been preserved since 1980, photographs, DNA analysis reports, and the original case files that had consumed investigators for decades. Sheriff Walsh praised the persistence of detectives who had refused to let the case fade into obscurity. Mary's nephew, born years after her death but raised on stories of his aunt's kindness and dreams, left a single daisy at her grave marker following the press conference. The white flower stood bright against the weathered stone that had waited 4 decades for the words "case closed" to be carved below Mary's name. The identification of Charles Strain officially ended the active investigation, but it also marked the beginning of healing for a family that had carried questions for nearly half a century. Summer 2024 brought an unprecedented moment of connection when Sacramento and Ada County communities held joint memorial vigils linked by video technology. Families from both cities gathered in their respective courthouses, sharing stories of loss, persistence, and ultimate resolution across hundreds of miles. The Sacramento ceremony featured Robin's photograph displayed alongside testimonials from scholarship recipients who had become nurses, teachers, and community leaders. Mrs. Brooks, now 79, spoke about transforming grief into purpose and never abandoning hope for justice. In Idaho, the vigil included displays of Mary's photography images she had captured during her final picnic, frozen moments of joy from an ordinary day that became extraordinary in retrospect. Her brother Jake had spent years organizing similar gatherings, building a network of families dealing with unsolved murders. Detective Reyes and Detective Olson participated in the joint ceremony via video link, sharing lessons learned from their decades-long investigations. They emphasized the importance of preserving evidence, supporting families, and embracing new technologies that could solve seemingly impossible cases. The church choir from Mary's hometown sang Amazing Grace while Robin's scholarship students lit candles in Sacramento. The dual ceremonies created a bridge between communities that had been connected by tragedy but separated by geography for 44 years. Victim advocacy groups used the joint vigil to highlight other unsolved cases, reminding attendees that hundreds of families still waited for answers. The Brooks and Tracy families had become symbols of persistence and hope for others navigating similar journeys. The vigils concluded with both communities reciting a pledge to remember all victims of violence and support families seeking justice. The ceremony was broadcast live on social media, reaching thousands of viewers who had followed both cases through their long journey toward resolution. Present day, 2025. A new class of police academy graduates toured the Sacramento PD's cold case unit on a crisp January morning, 45 years after Robin Brooks had been murdered. Detective Reyes, now a veteran supervisor, led the group through rooms lined with file cabinets containing hundreds of unsolved cases. Every box represents a family still waiting for answers, she told the young officers. Technology will continue to advance, but cases are solved by people who refuse to give up. Robin's file sat in a special display case marked Solved 2022 alongside Mary Tracy's file, which bore the notation Solved 2024. Both folders were thick with decades of investigation reports, laboratory analyses, and family correspondence that documented two families' refusal to let their daughters be forgotten. The tour included demonstrations of genetic genealogy techniques and DNA analysis equipment that hadn't existed when Robin and Mary were murdered. Academy graduates learned how evidence preservation had made recent breakthroughs possible, emphasizing the importance of treating every crime scene as if future science would eventually unlock its secrets. Mrs. Brooks visited the cold case unit monthly, bringing cookies for detectives and encouragement for families of recent victims. At 79, she had become an unofficial counselor for parents navigating the early stages of grief and investigation. Her presence reminded everyone that healing was possible even after decades of uncertainty. Above the cold case unit's entrance, a wooden sign carved by Jake Tracy bore the inscription, "Justice never sleeps." Below those words, in smaller letters, are mating the Groot's answers. Another message offered hope to families still waiting. Science advances. Truth endures. Love never gives up. The new officers filed past Robin's and Mary's solved cases, carrying forward the determination of investigators who had refused to let time diminish their commitment to finding truth. Justice moved slowly, but it moved.